Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask John and Stephen to come forward and sit right here in the front for the discussion. John, could you do that, please? About 30 minutes for discussion, but the next item in the program is lunch, so if you feel skipping lunch, not skip lunch, but if you feel like we can extend the discussion a little bit, if it goes well, then it shouldn't be a problem.
Unless James walks in.
Yeah. Okay. The floor is open. A lot of food for thought, and now it's time to discuss the ideas.
Are we in charge of, do you want to be the moderator?
Yeah, I'm moderator. Yeah, Monica.
Yes, Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska, Maria Curie University. One thing is a little clarification, because Adam surprised me with presenting my notorious translation, let's call it alternative or experimental translation of Winnie the Pooh. So I just want to say that...
Excuse me, if I may just say, the idea that a translation of Winnie the Pooh could be alternative and controversial is wonderful. I congratulate you.
What I want to clarify is that it's one of the myths surrounding this translation is that Winnie the Pooh is no longer a boy in my translation, which is not true. It's one of the myths. He has a female-sounding name, but he's not a girl. But that's just a verification. And
sorry, when I was taking shortcuts, so it was a little imprecise. Yes, sorry.
For the audience, because I am used to kind of, even if the translation was notorious, I kind of comfort myself that I gave work to a number of scholars and who can kind of analyze this translation.
It was famous, not notorious.
Yeah. Okay. But I want to, I have two comments, one about Hamlet, and the other is a kind of more general question. It's a very interesting example with this to be or not to be, or być albo nie być, but I think in Polish this quote functions at least two levels of discourse. There's this to być albo nie być is a kind of more modern usage in the context that you showed, and actually it would be interesting to see actually when it started functioning like this. But on the other hand, you have a Polish expression hamletyzować, which means to Hamletize. That is, behaves like Hamlet. That's precisely to ask the question to be or not to be. So when you use this expression, you may not quote it literally, but it's kind of behind you. And one of the reasons is, here you mentioned is Józef Paszkowski's translation. This is a great impact of Józef Paszkowski's translation, because actually this was the first successful translation. And the first translation, as far as, if I'm not mistaken, was done via German. And it was in prose by Wojciech Bogusławski. So here we have the case of a translation that gets deeply rooted into the linguistic and cultural system, and actually it starts living its own life. So another very good example from these polemics about translations, where there is an even greater change or deformation, is the famous quote, "Niech ryczy z bólu ranny łoś." So in the original you have deer, right? But here is łoś, which is mus. And Paszkowski introduced this quote because it sounds very well. I don't think Paszkowski didn't know that deer was yelling and that he that this was an error. This was a conscious choice because it's so rhythmical. And then there is this famous polemic between Słomczyński and Barańczak. Barańczak trying to replace this phrase with a more accurate one, but will it work? Has it worked?
Excuse me, could you just, what's the English for this? Do you remember, or can you give us
Yeah,
this is from Hamlet as well?
Yes, it's about the deer, I don't have the quote. It's it literally means let the wounded deer fall, faint. Well, we can find later. But another question, a general question, and to both Adam and also what you said, is how far can we go with translations of classics? Because here, Adam, for example, on this list of Polish translations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland mentioned Grzegorz Wasowski's translation. You also mentioned this new translation by Dougherty, which is, I understand, I don't know this translation, but more like a domestication, you said.
Yeah, pollinization. He calls it pollinization.
So what happens actually, and it's clearly visible in Polish culture, and it's probably in other cultures as well, that quite often it starts with a refraction, to use Andrea Lefebvre's, or adaptation. Then a time will comes for foreignization, for very close philological translation, but then how far can you go? So at a certain point, after let's say 20, 30 different translations, there is a kind of a reverse action, going back not even to adaptation or refraction, but something new, like some kind of paraphrase, pastiche, manipulation. And I think it's an interesting question to discuss.
You're the literary stuff.
Thanks very much. How far can you go? That's a good question. I don't know how far you can go. I mean, clearly it's a question of part of what's motivating, I think, a lot of the translation theory that I've been plugged into just recently has to do, of course, with reconceptualizations of originality. And so, you know, when you think about how far can you go, the way I understand your question is that you mean how far can you push this without recognizing the seed of originality. In other words, some guy named Shakespeare writes Hamlet. So how far can you go in terms of doing new and fresh things with the translation of Hamlet? Is this what you mean, more or less?
In general, yes.
Yeah.
Because the problem, of course, when we talk about a series of translations, is that actually, you know, most translators usually know these earlier translations.
Mm-hmm.
So there is also a problem, of course, if it's a very accurate, annotated translation, a translator may acknowledge that here in my translation I used all these earlier translations,
right.
But the question is, to what extent can I borrow from these translations? And quite often such authors, and here when I mentioned Dougherty and Wasowski, they are actually writers themselves. Mm. So the question, they actually, you know, are inspired by this text, but the question is, can we treat these works as translations, or even adaptations?
I think part of, one way of answering the question, responding to the question, is to think about Shakespeare. Well, how far did Shakespeare go in order to write Hamlet, in order to compose Hamlet? In other words, he's working from sources too. So genetic criticism will tell you a lot about what Shakespeare's sources were, what he did in order to, manipulate and modify these sources and so on. So in some ways, I feel like it's a question that you can keep pushing back. And so that's one way of responding to your question. This is, which might not be a very good way, but nevertheless, this is what I want to offer.
Again, who knows how far you can go? I think the question is not how far you can go, but at what point people choose to call it a translation or not call it a translation. Again, I referred to Robert Lowell's book of poems, which he calls imitations. And he explicitly says that his goal is to write, for instance, a poem by Baudelaire as if Baudelaire were an American living in the United States in the 1950s, which is exactly what Dryden had said in the 1600s about his translations, I believe, of Homer. He said, I want to write Homer as if Homer was an Englishman. What would he have written? An Englishman of the 17th century, what would he have written? Which is the philosophy behind the Belles Infidèles. And maybe the problem, maybe the reason people are so hostile to the Belles Infidèles is that they called what they were doing translation instead of calling it imitation or calling it. I don't know if it's colonization. But I mean, I don't know. Is Armageddon Now, the film, a translation of Heart of Darkness? I think most of us would say no, but it's clearly completely drawn from Heart of Darkness, and everyone acknowledges that. Does that make it? I don't know. What this makes me think of, though, is, again, to go back to Borges, is the Edward Fitzgerald 19th century translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a medieval Persian poem, translated into English in Victorian times as a Victorian English poem, which keeps the specific rhyme scheme of the Persian, I think, and became one of the great classics of modern English literature. And little Anglophones learn and memorize verses from Omar Khayyam. But in fact, it's not Omar Khayyam, it's Edward Fitzgerald. Borges wrote an essay on this, saying that Edward Fitzgerald by himself was a second-rate or third-rate poet. Borges claims that Omar Khayyam by himself is not a particularly great poet, although I don't think Borges knew Persian, but that the two of them together become a single great poet. A kind of marriage through time. Again, Borges is working to be as paradoxical and shocking as he possibly can. What I would, and then more recently, Penguin Books has come out with a real translation of Omar Khayyam in the Penguin Books style. And in the English-speaking world, Penguin classics style translations are very well known. They've changed recently, but traditionally it was always the most easily readable, straightforward, modern style, bland translation of a text, of the referential content of a text. So they managed to make what I think is a boring Rabelais, and the first publication of the Penguin Classics series was the founder, E.V. Rieu's translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which someone called the Agatha Christie version of Homer. You know, the gods get together to talk about things on Earth and the war in Troy, and he translates that as a committee.
Not always, though, because Megershak, Ishiguro's great translator.
More recently,
the Penguin Fold also.
Yeah, the Penguin Fold has opened up more recently, along with general movements in translation theory, but you have this model. The Penguin Omar Khayyam is okay, and it's very, very different from Fitzgerald, but it doesn't read like poetry, particularly. What I would like to see is a thick Omar Khayyam. I would like to see, and you can't do this maybe with the whole text, but I'd like to see even just a few verses of Omar Khayyam presented in Persian, presumably in a Latin letter transcription, so you can get an idea of the sounds, and explained so that we can get a sense of why this was considered great poetry in Persian, and what it is about Persian poetry. And there, yeah, it was.
Okay, we've got two questions, one from Marco, then from Carsten, but before that I'd like to read that verse from Hamlet about the deer. Why let the stricken deer go to weep, the hart and gold play? For some must watch, while some must sleep, so runs the world away.
So
And
must
there
watch
the first line here is from the third act. So Paszkowski went for wash, which is moose, and then another translator, Barańczak, used the word jeleń, which in Polish is for deer. But the first one is really what's...
In the English-speaking world, the piece of that everyone knows is some must watch while some must sleep.
Yeah.
That's taken.
Poles are a hunting nation. So that's why I remember the first one.
Marco.
Yeah, thank you. So Marco Pajevic, and thank you very much. I think there were in both papers we approached that crucial question of this all, and that is how comes newness into the world. Yeah, and translation obviously can serve as a kind of a paradigm for thinking about this issue. What I would like to just suggest quickly that we be aware of the political choices that we make in responding to this issue of how newness comes into the world. And obviously now there's some very interesting quotations by Macfarlane and Wolkowitz, that it's copying, yeah, obviously that very much relates to our nowadays situation. We use this in order to make sense of the world within the framework of our references and so on. So of course, in former times, this question was answered by God, yeah, we were inspired by God. Then it was a cult of the genius, yeah, so the individual came and times of romanticism and another answer to that. And now we are more and more, and I of course agree to that in many ways, it's a very good metaphor for it, that it's copying things that are there anyway. We are part of a network. We can also be somehow reproduced in technical terms. Yeah, our metaphors are more and more related to the world of computers. But if we do this, and I agree to many things, I think we should not forget that there's a new element to that. Yeah? And so how do we relate that to the question of what makes humanity? Yeah? So the question of our vision of what makes a human human is at stake there. And so if we talk about that in those terms, what are the choices, what are the consequences of those kind of choices? Maybe just, if you want to, I don't want to monopolize that, get a reaction from you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question. And obviously, you know, you have to, it's trading a fine line, you know, when you talk about these issues. And I think Wolkowitz, for example, tries to be quite careful, and I was trying to be, you know, careful and sort of in repeating and reiterating some of the things that are being said these days about translation. I mean, I think and there's something quite shocking in a way about her paradigm of what she calls unoriginality. You know, she says we have to learn to value unoriginality. Well, what does she mean by that? Because on the surface it sounds totally wrong. It sounds like God, it sounds terrible.
But it's a very original statement.
Yes, it's an original claim, an original statement. And she's very careful, and these other writers that I've been talking about today, they're very careful, I think, to communicate that they're not talking about originality and creativity disappearing from the world. This isn't their point at all. And in terms of what it is that makes us human, I mean, I think that this way of looking at things, this paradigm, if we're following Wolkowitz and we want to use her language, this paradigm of unoriginality that she promotes, well, I think that she's touting something that does make us very, very human, which is to say we share things, we share ideas. And so for me anyway, it's this word sharing is tremendously important. So, you know, when you think about when you introduce copies and you're talking about copies and simulations and so on, and immediately all sorts of warning bells go off in our heads because we think of the Matrix and, you know, we think of this and that, all these terrible science fiction scenarios. But I don't think that Wolkowitz, for example, means it that way. I certainly don't mean it that way. Macfarlane doesn't mean it that way. Because what they're talking about is the human impulse that we have to share.
Yeah, thank you very much. I haven't read the book, but I will. It sounds very interesting. And I think that's exactly one way of turning it, you know, to read this kind of interpretation of these processes of meaning making and so on, and newness and originality as a possibility of a global vision of humanity. And so it's all, in translation there plays again a big role, yeah? So it's just with all these various positions and so on that we are constantly shifting and thereby changing and defining ourselves in different ways. So it's just by a planetary vision, if you want to, that we can see humanity fully. That's hopefully her vision, as you mentioned now, I think, might be. And then, of course, yeah, what you said, sorry, before that, that's now a very interesting point. So the morphine. Oh, sorry. Because yours somewhere doesn't work anymore.
No, I'm on. I'm just wondering if you're on.
Yeah, if you're on, I'm not.
That's right.
Okay.
I mean, that's the way it works. It can be one person at a time. So if you switch yours on, then you switch on the other person.
It's still not working. It worked before.
Keep trying until it works.
Should I be on or off? I should be off, right?
Maybe.
I guess so. But Marco should be able to switch you off.
It worked before, no, it doesn't. Nothing works.
I'm sorry about that. Marco, we just speak up.
Mine works.
Well, they want you to hear you, not me. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that your point, the traditional war, which is of course a traditional Humboldt, is very important there as well. So this diversity, which is the foundation of the richness of the human mind. Yeah? So that's why I said it's present in both your papers in this way. Yeah? So how comes translation into that? Maybe more concretely to the topic of our conference. What exactly and how exactly does it work? And we have had a few examples for that.
I think in a modern capitalist society, there is a strong pressure toward ideologies of individuality, of the individual. I think there has been since the 17th century. Romanticism is a particularly acute version of that. I think it would be very interesting to look at these new movements that are almost seem ready to accept a demotion of individuality. I mean, I think Michel Foucault gave a speech once in which he said, "I don't want to be speaking. I just want speech to come through me," which was very shocking for people at the time. To really accept that one is part of something bigger than oneself is very disturbing for someone, at least for someone from, it was being imposed in the Soviet bloc for so many years. It was being attacked in the West for so many years. But, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that so many anti-individualists, if you like, sorry, it's Wolkowski? Wolkowitz, who I didn't know at all before this morning, are still formulating their shocking anti-individualist statements in very memorable ways, so that she may well be remembered for this as an individual author.
She said another quote, one quote from her book, "There are no languages without foreign languages," which is great, memorable for her.
She's really good at this, clearly, and will be remembered as an individual for her brilliant attacks on individuality.
I said that I was saying that one of the things that we do, humans, that we share. Well, actually, we don't do a whole lot of sharing. I mean, we have to recognize the relationship between the ideology of originality and the ideology of private property, and it's a real tight and important relationship. And so I do think that these, when you talk about recognizing the political implications, I think that's exactly right, and that's a very important point to make. And I do think that the political implications are quite progressive, in terms of the kinds of politics that these writers and thinkers and theorists are trying to embrace and nurture.
If I may tell a personal anecdote, in 1996, we had a panel for my teacher Paul Friedrich's, I guess, 70th birthday. And I came up with the idea of a paper called Thick Translation. It was the first thing I performed in public about translation. And I was very proud of that. And I thought I came up with something really good and new. Anti-individualistic as it was, but I was proud of myself. And I thought it was my property. And then I discovered that a few months earlier, a critic named Kwame Appiah, oh dear, I don't remember his last name, that's terrible. No, Kwame Anthony Appiah had, the cosmopolitanism guy at Harvard, had written a piece on thick translation, which to some degree paralleled my ideas. So I couldn't call my paper thick translation anymore, and I had to acknowledge this. But I swear I hadn't stolen it from him. When it becomes a question of private property, what phrases are owned by whom? If I started talking about the value of unoriginality without attributing that, then that would be plagiarism, and plagiarism is still bad. There's all kinds of wonderful Borgesian contradictions in this world.
Although obviously the whole issue of plagiarism comes up for rediscussion, I think, too, as a result of all of this. There are students still out there. I don't mean that you should plagiarize. All I mean is obviously the whole question of plagiarism is bound up with some of the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, okay, they say if it's a good idea, then someone must have already had it.
Yes.
Carsten, and then Elżbieta.
The system's broke, it seems.
Doesn't matter.
Okay, I'll ask a technician in when we take a recess.
Carsten Leavitt, Roskilde University, Denmark.
You can use this.
Oh.
I can use this one. I can also just speak up.
Yeah, good.
A comment and a question mainly for you, John. I want to ask you more about thick, but first a comment because you mentioned the sort of militant anti-Warfianism that was in the US, and you asked how was it here, and I mean, from a Scandinavian perspective, I could literally see semester for semester how the anti-Warfianism fell apart.
Wow.
And I sort of witnessed it. I just read all these anti-Warfian textbooks that were still around, but you could see
In linguistics or
in
literature?
linguistics,
Or?
in linguistics, and you could see the lecturers shifting the views on that's just what's in the textbook. But really, and then they started talking about things like Warfian effects. So that, I mean, there is a generation, probably my generation, that would sort of have seen it all fall apart. Of course, there will still be pockets of anti-Warfian thinking, but I thought I would tell you that since you asked for information on this. And then, yeah, I also wanted to ask you about thick translation. I guess I would like to hear your version then of, could you say a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more what you mean? For instance, if we have something like Google Translate, then it is sometimes fairly horrible, ugly translations that come out of it. Would that be thick because it is ugly? That's my question.
No, that would be very thin. You know, it's true. Thin translations can be ugly too. It is a different dimension from beauty and ugliness. But generally, well, my idea about thick translation was that people usually try to translate the referential meaning. Just the referential meaning. Just what you perceive as the important part of the referential meaning. So that, for instance, if you're translating from French or Polish to English, you suppress gender, because gender doesn't really matter. In fact, they've been doing, you know, I was always told in elementary school in my French class, you have to learn that it's la table and le mur. And it doesn't mean the table is a girl and the wall is a boy. For the French. For the French, it's just a part of their language, and they don't think about it consciously, and it doesn't have any meaning. course it has a meaning, if you want to use meaning in a broad sense. And when they conceive of the sun and the moon, they conceive of the sun as male somehow, if they're going to personalize it, and the moon as female in French. And that changes completely from language to language, and it does seem to follow linguistic gender. I don't know if you know the work of Lyra Boroditsky. She's a Russian-American psycholinguist or linguistics psychologist who's done experiments that show that there is a kind of unconsciousness, an unconscious, semi-conscious presence of gender in languages with sex-based gender. She had, well, before her, a Japanese researcher had asked German speakers and I believe Spanish speakers to look at a picture of a key and a bridge. And a key in Spanish is feminine and a bridge is masculine, and describe it. And the Spanish speakers describe the bridge in typically culturally masculine terms. The bridge is solid, it's strong, it's reliable. The key is delicate. Keys are not usually beautiful, but they're clearly feminine sort of associations. For the Germans, the key is hard and the bridge, die Brücke, is elegant. It almost sounds like a fashion magazine description. So I can't remember the guy's name, but it was a Japanese or a Japanese American researcher who found this. What Boroditsky did was to say, okay, it's possible that this isn't really a real conceptual effect. It's simply the presence of gender in the language they're too close. So she asked bilinguals, from Spanish-based bilinguals and German-based bilinguals in English, to do the same experiment. And so they were all speaking English. There was no immediate gender effect, because in English it's just the, right? And she got exactly the same results. People who are native German speakers describe the bridge as elegant in typically feminine terms, and the key in typically masculine terms, and the reverse with original Spanish speakers. So there's clearly an effect of gender. But Jakobson had described this in his article on translation in 1959. It's what he calls everyday mythology. It's things like the sun and the moon. So even something like gender has an effect. The question is, if you're in a translation, you could do a translation in which you talk about the table from French into English. The table, feminine. Because you don't know what the limits are. And this is even in the referential aspect of it. You could do a translation that involves a lot of what often is found in notes at the bottom of the page. Explaining the background, explaining the context and the implications of, for instance, grammatical categories like gender, how that works in the original. So when I talk about thickening, putting layers and layers of, if you want to call it interpretation, but it's really just factual data. French has gender. A certain language may not have tense, but it may have a evidentiality. That is, you have to specify how you know what it is you are saying, and every verb carries a marker that makes it explicit whether what you're saying you know because you witnessed it directly, or heard it by hearsay, or got it out of a dream, as in Kwakwala in BC. There's a special form for knowledge you have through dreams. If you use the wrong form, you're lying. Okay? Just like if you mix up tense, certainly in English, French, Western European, I imagine in Polish, if a student says to me, I finished the paper, but what they mean is, I will finish the paper, that's considered a lie. But all they've done is mix up a grammatical category. The context is the same. So thick translation the goal is not to produce an easily metabolizable text for the reader. It's kind of the extreme of taking the reader toward the author. But it means the reader has to do a lot of work. A really thick translation is probably not commercially viable. But again, simply keeping all the repetitions in Homer would be a degree of thickness greater than if you remove all the repetition. To say that Homer has maybe a cultic or ritual status, which involves repetition, instead of removing them so the reader doesn't get annoyed because it's always the wine dark sea or the rosy fingered dawn, that's a step toward, it's preserving as much as you can of the original. It's radically socist, not necessarily foreignizing, but certainly sources. That's what I mean by it. And maybe it can only be practiced by academics. Maybe professional translators, who make a living at it, can't do this. Your other point, textbooks are fascinating. Because textbooks, because of the extremely, the monstrously carnivorous way textbook publishers act, because they have to get as much money out of the poor students as they possibly can. They have to re-edit textbooks every year, and last year's edition, which cost $300, is no longer usable. The students are forced to buy the new edition. It means they do keep changing. And yes, I've traced the same process of de-Whorfinization through, for instance, textbooks on semantics, through the 1950s, where they're extremely Whorfian and also talk a lot about German semantic field theory, Trier and Weisgerber and these German neo-Humboldtian, particularly semantic field theory of Trier. It just disappears through the 60s in textbooks. And the link between semantics and culture disappears. And semantics becomes a purely cognitive question through the 1960s. Stays that way through the 80s, and then changes again in the 90s.
Doesn't work, so I'm trying to speak up. Now, and first of all, I'd like to thank you, John, for the beautiful mini lecture on cognitive semantics.
Thank you.
About gender, because this is what I think really matters from the linguistic point of view for discussions about and on translation. Now, I don't really have a question, because I don't think there can be answers to the most crucial issues that have been raised. What I'd like to say is that Schleiermacher's classical distinction between foreignization and domestication implies a dichotomy, and this, in fact, is pretty harmful. Because what we actually get is a continuum where it's very difficult to say this is foreignization, this is domestication. Because even if we have the illusion that on the linguistic level we have actually performed the translation, what we produce is at most a cultural hybrid. Because grammar of the target language inevitably drags in its own culture into the thing. Now, in this connection, a rejoinder to what Adam was talking about, somehow I feel caught up, because you mentioned my translation of yet another classic, Alice in Wonderland. Now, there is a tiny little anecdote behind it, which shows you how complex actually the matrix of cultural factors is. I never thought about doing the translation until the editors rang me and said, oh, would you translate Alice in Wonderland for us? And I say, why? There are 10 translations already in existence, and is there a need for another one? And they said, oh, yes, yes. Because we got this set of illustrations by Tove Jansson, and none of translations, Polish translations, fits. Okay? So we need a new one that would correspond to Tove Janssen's set of pictures, which had been well known in Poland because of the Moments series.
Of course, that's who Tove Jansson is.
That's right.
Now, what
Yeah.
I produced then was a Polish version of a Victorian novel, fitted it in with the Finnish style illustrations. Now, that is a hybrid, the utmost of hybridization, and it usually happens like this. Therefore, to foreign eyes, or not to foreign eyes, is not like to be or not to be. Even though to be and not to be is not dichotomous either. Okay?
Let me first say how absolutely thrilled I am to be in the room with a translator of Alice. I'm deeply honored. For me, Alice, and particularly Through the Looking Glass, are fundamental linguistic texts. One of the good things about the idea of thickness is that it's not dichotomous. It's a continuum. It can be more or less thick, more or less thin. I think that's a point in its favor. I was wondering to what extent Joseph Conrad, to what extent he was Polish. He was completely Polish, obviously, but he mastered English to the point that he could write great classics in English. I'm wondering if people have worked on the Polishness of Heart of Darkness, I would imagine, and to what extent that's taken into account. You know, do people translate Heart of Darkness in trying to imagine how Joseph Conrad would have written it in Polish? I mean, that's a question I throw out.
Now, Edwardson, can I just comment on that? There is a linguist in Sheffield who has discovered, I don't know whether he's published anything on it, but I know it from personal communication. He said that the originality of Conrad's style in English is interference from Polish, right? And he had a lot of evidence to all that. One more question, if I may, a brief one. What is the status of the original? Because if you look at what we have here on the slide, characteristically those three processes, tuning out, turning up, and fine-tuning, are performed upon something that someone else has done rather than had done. So it is still going on and changing.
Something, I'm sorry, I didn't get the verb tense thing at the end. Something.
I was thinking about the present perfect. Right? Changing, amplifying, turning up and so on.
Yeah.
What someone else has done rather than had done. And I think it's fairly significant. Because what is the original? And when was the original and where?
What is
and
the original?
I didn't ask a question because I don't think there is an
Yeah,
answer.
that's such an important question. You did ask a question. What is the original, right? And so, and I think that the point is that the original is not what we think it is. You know, because of course we think of the original as the source. This is the place from which, you know, this is the origin point. And then of course that origin point has a history behind it as well, and so on and so forth. So what is the original? That's yeah, of course that's a really good question, and there are different ways of answering the question, and so we're talking about different ways of responding to the question, rather than the conventional way. We think, well, of course the original is this person's text, right, written in 1945, and blah blah blah. And that was the inception, the origin point, and there was nothing behind that because it's a work of genius, and therefore it's created out of nothing. But of course, if you don't assume that it's created out of nothing, but that it has a history as well, then the question, what is an original, becomes a different kind of question. And I just wanted to respond real briefly. I don't know whether this is, you know, the Tove Jansson illustrations. And, well, that's such a wonderful thing. And then, of course, you realize that there's, you know, we're conditioned to think about translation, about the practice of translation in terms of this sort of corporate model, right? Well, it's for the sake of the industry. You know, you translate because there are English readers who are going to want to read Dostoevsky. They can't read it in Russian, and so it's for the purpose of making money. And therefore, of course, you're going to try to appeal to the broadest public that you can, and so there is going to be a certain privileging of blandness, as you say, right? But then here is a very special occasion. And so there must be a very, very rich history of translations, you know, that are motivated by special occasions. And this is just sort of a way, for me anyway, this is a real way of kind of humanizing the work of translation. Yes, you got these great illustrations, so what are you going to do with it? You know, you're going to write a text that's different, you know, from the previous Alice's, for the sake of incorporating these illustrations in now.
May I ask why the previous translations didn't work with these illustrations? Were the illustrations showing things that were in the English but that hadn't been picked up in the translations?
See, there was a set of illustrators, Polish artists, producing illustrations for Alice in Wonderland. Several Polish translations were published with the original 10 years illustration.
Which of course weren't really the originals, because Lewis Carroll Dodgson had done his own drawings for the manuscripts, which were then replaced by Tenniel.
Yes, and 10 years illustrations are just the proof of there not being one set original, because the way they were received by Victorian children was nothing like what Polish children would think in the 20th century. So Tenniel was out. The other three, they said, were too Polish. Interestingly enough, the one published in 1910, practically it could have been used because there were no copyrights necessary for it. But then the Mad Hare lived in a Polish mountaineer's wooden hut, for instance, right? And Alice was wearing a Charleston sort of
1920s.
Yeah, the use of Charleston ladies' fashion. So these were out, but the more recent ones, they said they just didn't fit, and the texts seemed to the editors in charge of the new translation too outdated, too domesticated, too exotic in one case, too stupid in one case, and they said Tove Jansson wouldn't have it, wouldn't have any of those Polish texts to come with her illustration.
Had these already been used in another language, in Finnish, or in? Were they originally done for a translation?
I don't think so really, because it was a fairly recent discovery and quite a big thing. Somebody has discovered a set of illustrations and made a lot of ado about it. And that's how it all started. But they said the old translations were well suited to the old illustrations. The old illustrations were not good enough. Tove Jansson was, so we needed the text to fit Tove Jansson. If it does, I don't know.
Look, we've already intruded onto the lunch break by some 30 minutes, but that's okay. I mean, the next session starts at 3 o'clock, and we'll still have a lot of time for lunch, so if you feel like having more questions for another 10-15 minutes, will be okay. Does anyone have a point to make? Yes, Henry.
Henry Cardella, this university. I'm sort of interested about this sort of term genetic criticism. Genetic criticism, which resembles or perhaps is similar to what is called reception in literary studies. And it seems to me that reception, as understood, from time to time is taken, you know, seriously by various authors. So, for example, they experiment with texts because academic, let's say, scholarship, well, sees or uncovers new areas of analysis, of linguistic analysis. So you have different flashbacks, you go back and then forward, and things of this sort, subjectivization phenomena just crop up and things of this sort. Now, is it the correct way of seeing things, that if we have this kind of an equation mark between genetic criticism, as used, you know, the critics write about different translations, should translators actually take now this thing into account as well? You mentioned now this thickness problem, but of course, if they do, then that's a problem of originality where it crops up and things, you know, have to be again taken into account. What do you think? To what extent now should now this genetic criticism be taken into account? So, for example, I'm not sure whether you know the translation by Dougherty. Maybe, you know, he's well trained, you know, in those literary analyses. I'm not sure, but probably he is.
Well, I have the impression about Dougherty. I have the impression that he's such an original writer. For those of you who are not familiar with the contemporary Polish literature, he's one of the most acclaimed and original science fiction and fantasy writers today, and I get the impression that he just couldn't resist. The Heart of Darkness is such a rich source to draw from. His book is I mean, the story is the same, but it reads completely different way in terms of style, and in a way it reminded me of Coppola's Apocalypse Now, which is also a translation, at least in two ways, into film and changing the story. Although in Dougherty's colonization, the story is the same. It takes place in Africa. It takes place at the same time, so it's not a different story. But, okay, now, sorry, I give the floor to you.
I'll start with. This is not my field. Okay, I tread here very carefully. But my impression is that reception theory and genetic criticism are very different in the sense that, well, they almost balance each other. Genetic criticism, as I understand it, is about the production of the text and the complexity of the genesis of the text, and the fact that you can have all kinds of versions before the original one. Before the one that comes to be taken as the original. Reception theory is kind of about what happens after that and how the text is received by readers. It's close to what they call reader response theory, which is something I've been very interested in, because I'm interested in how the people who are sitting in the room are receiving the performance by the singer. And by the God, because the God is possessing someone and speaking through them. Should it be taken into account by the translator? Well, that depends on what the translator is trying to do. I mean, I don't, you know, it's certainly a dimension of thickness. Yes, I mean, to do the kind of translation I'm interested in, both of those aspects would be absolutely fundamental, I think. But again, the genesis of an oral text in a tradition like this, which is an oral formulaic tradition, that's something that, you know, Milman Perry and Albert Lord spent their careers on. How it is that a singing bard, who's often illiterate, learns to perform by listening to other bards. What is it that he's usually a man in these cases, picks up from the other bard? In a sense, the entire work of oral formulaic analysis is a kind of genetic criticism of oral formulaic texts, how they come to be. I'm particularly interested myself in how they're received, in what aspects of people's lives are highlighted, brought up in these texts, which means knowing about their particular lives, what's stereotypically good and bad in their lives, things like that.
I'd like to add something.
Let me use one more little point. Many of the what I gave you was not a narrative text. It was part of the opening section that brings the gods. Then the gods hear the stories, which are all in the second person. You know, your 7 stepmothers tried to kill you. And they're talking to the god who's there in front of them in the person of a possessed medium. So the god is there. And you escaped. This is how you escaped. You were put in a box and put on the river. You floated up the river. The whole thing is in second person. And in modern literature, you know, second person is used very rarely and has an enormous, bizarre impact. You know, we never read texts very, very rarely, and that often becomes the most striking thing about the text. Well, these are all in second person because you're talking to a being who is supposed to be, who is understood to be there, right there.
In terms of the relationship between genetic criticism and reception theory, I think John is right. They're not the same thing. They're quite different. But nevertheless, reception theory can be reception history. It's very, very importantly folded into genetic criticism. And it makes up part of the history. And reception is a part of the history, especially for thinking about translations. It's part of the ongoing history of translations, of the work of translation. So just last week we had at the university in Norway where I teach, our translation and intercultural communication research group posted a Norwegian translator, Leif Hubhaug, who is currently working on a translation of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake into Norwegian. And he read for us, and it was an amazing thing. And just a wonderful voice and just a terrific performance, and you have to perform it. I mean, it demands performance. And he said that the reception, the critical reception, you know, of Finnegan's Wake, the history of that critical reception was very, very important in terms of helping him to figure out how to translate Finnegan's Wake into Norwegian. And so, you know, Norwegian for him was a language that was very, very fertile ground for translation of Finnegan's Wake because of the complexity, because of the nature of Norwegian. There's bokmål, there's nynorsk, and these are two languages. It's Norwegian, but Norwegian means so many different things, and dialects are so incredibly rich and different in Norway. It's just a continuum of dialects. So this gave him lots of opportunity for invention, for creation in his translation. But the reception theory the reception history was very, very important for him in his work of translation.
I suppose we'd rather stop here because we do need some time for lunch. We'll meet again at 3 o'clock. Okay, thank you, John. Thanks, Stephen, for your papers, and thank everyone for the discussion. It's been great, and I hope this will continue this way after the break in the session. Thanks. See you.